December 1944. The snow lay heavy over a small prisoner of war camp near Andernach, Germany. Rows of frost-crusted barbed wire glistened under a dull grey dawn. Inside the compound, a group of German women prisoners huddled near a steaming pot. They were nurses, auxiliaries, and civilian staff captured in the final months of the Allied advance. Their eyes followed the American soldiers moving between makeshift kitchens, men in thick wool coats, their breath ghosting into the winter air. From one of the field ovens, a strange smell began to spread. Sweet, buttery, warm. It didn't belong here, not in this place of hunger and humiliation. The women exchanged looks of disbelief. "What is that?" one whispered, her tone half mocking. The Americans were baking something unfamiliar, something yellow, coarse and rustic. Cornbread. To the German palate, used to dark rye and dense barley loaves, it seemed laughable. Her peasants' food. They smirked at the rough texture, the uneven surface. One woman called it tierfutter, animal feed. But the laughter, faint and brittle in the cold, didn't last long. Hunger had a way of humbling pride. A few hours later, when a mess sergeant carried over a pan of the stuff to share, the smell was irresistible. Butter and cornmeal mingled with wood smoke and winter air. The first cautious bites turned into silent eating. Then came murmurs of surprise, then requests for more. The same women who mocked it now leaned close to the pan, savoring every crumb. What began as ridicule ended in reverence. To understand that moment, one must step back from the frost of 1944 and trace the path that brought cornbread, of all things, into the heart of war-torn Europe. Cornbread was America itself in edible form, a product of its soil, its abundance, and its improvisation. It traveled with pioneers in wagons and soldiers in tin mess kits. By the time of World War II, it had become the taste of the U.S. Army's field kitchens, a reliable source of calories, easy to prepare, and immune to morale fatigue. In an age when bread symbolized civilization, American cornbread symbolized resourcefulness. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps had spent years perfecting field rations that were cheap, transportable, and morale-sustaining. In the European theater, where wheat supplies were strained and logistical lines stretched across the Atlantic, cornmeal was plentiful back home. The American home front, guided by the War Food Administration, shipped millions of tons of corn products overseas. Every soldier's kitchen truck carried sacks of yellow meal beside canned beans and powdered milk. It was more than food. It was continuity, the taste of home in an alien land. For the German prisoners, the idea of eating corn was almost offensive. In pre-war Germany, maize was largely reserved for livestock feed. Bread was sacred, dark, dense, carefully measured under the Reich's strict food regulations. Even at the front, German field bakeries labored to maintain the cultural ritual of daily bread. To them, the American yellow loaf seemed crude, almost barbaric. Yet it was this very barbarism that reflected a different kind of strength. While the Wehrmacht struggled to feed its prisoners, the American forces turned food into a weapon of ideology. Feeding the enemy well was psychological warfare in its most humane form. In camps like Andernach and Hohenfels, American cooks prepared full meals not just for their own troops, but also for captured Germans, women included. The cornbread became an unlikely ambassador, an edible handshake from conqueror to captive. Inside those camps, the daily rhythm of life blurred rank and ideology. German women who once typed orders in Berlin now queued beside farmhands and medics. They were cold, defeated, and waiting to be processed. The American guards, many scarcely older than the prisoners, kept their distance but not their humanity. One corporal from Ohio, whose mother baked cornbread every Sunday, volunteered for kitchen duty. He carried that tradition with him, mixing flour and cornmeal, pouring batter into iron trays, baking by instinct rather than recipe. When the bread emerged golden and fragrant, he cut it into rough squares. He handed a few pieces across the fence. One of the German women, a former Red Cross nurse, accepted it hesitantly. She sniffed, frowned, then bit. A moment later, her expression softened. The taste, sweet, warm, unfamiliar, spoke of another world. She passed the piece to her companions, who ate in silence, their mockery forgotten. Word spread through the camp. The Americans had strange bread, maize brought. Women began trading their cigarette rations for slices. Some even tried to imitate it with powdered meal and water. baking their own versions over makeshift stoves. In a place defined by deprivation, the cornbread became a symbol of abundance. Behind that simple gesture lay a vast machinery of war and logistics. The U.S. Army's food supply chain spanned oceans. From Midwestern grain elevators to Normandy supply dumps, cornmeal traveled in burlap sacks stamped U.S. Army Subsistence Depot. Field kitchens were mobile marvels, steel counters, portable ovens, collapsible sinks, all standardized by American industry. The Quartermaster Research and Development Center in Chicago worked tirelessly to ensure that every ingredient, from cornmeal to canned fruit, could survive transport, temperature swings, and rough handling. Engineers like Dr. Robert C. Baker, later famous for the chicken nugget, experimented with field-friendly mixes that soldiers could cook anywhere. Meanwhile, the German supply system had collapsed under Allied bombing. Trains stopped, bakeries lacked flour, and civilians survived on ersatz mixtures of sawdust and turnip meal. When American cornbread arrived, it was more than sustenance, it was the taste of victory, the tangible proof of an enemy whose factories still roared while Europe smoldered. Some German diaries, written years later, recalled the memory of that bread with startling emotion. One former auxiliary described it as the first warm food that felt safe. Another called it humiliation baked into kindness. It was the paradox of war, the conqueror feeding the conquered, and the conquered tasting comfort from the hands of the enemy. The American guards didn't think of it as diplomacy. To them it was habit, routine. The recipe was simple: 1 part flour, 1 part cornmeal, sugar, salt, baking powder, milk and eggs when available. Baked at 400 degrees until the top browned. In civilian life it was eaten with honey or butter. In war it was served plain. Yet even stripped of luxury, it carried something powerful, a memory of home kitchens, of mothers and Sunday tables, of a world untouched by shellfire. Night after night, the ovens glowed inside the camp's mess area. The Germans would watch through the wire as steam rose from the trays. The laughter that once echoed at the sight of the crude yellow squares had vanished. In its place came quiet gratitude, even awe. They couldn't understand why it tasted so good, only that it did. As the new year of 1945 approached, the prisoners' faces grew thinner, but their demeanor softened. The Americans noticed it too. One lieutenant wrote in his notebook that the women seem calmer after meals. Some even smile. Perhaps it was hunger, perhaps something deeper. Food had Bridget began with a single act of sharing, but behind that golden loaf lay an empire of invention. Cornbread, though humble, represented a triumph of industrial science. To feed millions of men scattered across continents, the U.S. Army relied on a supply system so vast and precise that it could deliver warm bread to the front lines within hours. That feat was not luck, it was engineering. The Quartermaster Corps had, by 1943, perfected mobile kitchens capable of feeding 250 soldiers at once. Each kitchen truck carried ovens powered by gasoline burners, collapsible mixing tables, and storage bins for dry rations. The innovation wasn't just mechanical, it was logistical. Cornmeal, lighter and more durable than wheat flour, could be stored for months without spoilage. Its use reduced dependency on Europe's ravaged grain supply. The quartermaster engineers called it nutritional independence. Cornmeal, like most American staples, owed its consistency to industry. Mills in Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois worked around the clock, turning out thousands of pounds a day. Packaged under government contracts, each sack was labeled by region, Midwest number, to yellow dent. The grain came from farmers whose sons were already overseas, feeding comrades with the same corn they had grown. It was a circle of sustenance as vast as the war itself. In 1944, when General Eisenhower demanded continuous advances through France and into Germany, the Army Service Forces responded by doubling the rations delivered daily to combat units. Each soldier received roughly 4,000 calories per day, an unprecedented figure compared to the lean rations of Axis troops. In that balance of logistics lay the silent power of the Allied campaign. American soldiers didn't just march, they ate, and they ate well. At the center of this system was a machine as symbolic as any tank or rifle, the field bakery. These mobile bakeries, built by companies like General Electric and Baker Perkins, could turn out 2,000 loaves in a single shift. Mounted on Trucks they moved with advancing divisions, ensuring fresh bread even in bombed-out towns. The cornbread that reached POW camps was often baked in the same ovens that once fed frontline troops. Its journey from sack to pan to prisoner fence traced the entire arc of Allied dominance. For the Germans inside those fences, this abundance was incomprehensible. They had watched their own army starve on the Eastern Front, reduced to stealing potatoes from frozen fields. Now, in captivity, they smelled food rich with butter and eggs. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans were wasting resources, feeding their enemies better than the Reich had fed its soldiers. Yet for the Americans, generosity was part of the message. This is what victory looks like. One afternoon in January 1945, a convoy of supply trucks rolled into the Andernach camp. Among their cargo, 500 pounds of cornmeal and boxes of baking powder. The cooks got to work. Snow still fell, but inside the mess tent the air shimmered with heat. Buckets of batter lined the tables. The corporal from Ohio poured ladle after ladle into trays, his hands steady, even as artillery rumbled faintly in the distance. When the bread came out, he divided it into equal portions, one for every prisoner. That night, a young German translator assigned to the camp wrote in her journal about the strange feeling that came over her. They give us warm bread, not to mock us, but because they can. It frightens me. Her words captured the quiet revelation spreading through the ranks of the defeated. The Americans were not starving their captives. They were feeding them decently, methodically, as if the war's hatred had already begun to cool. Technically, cornbread was a masterpiece of efficiency. Each slice delivered more calories per ounce than standard wheat bread, and its ingredients could be sourced entirely from American soil. Its simplicity was its strength. Unlike the intricate rye loaves that required fermentation, cornbread could be mixed and baked within minutes. It required no yeast, no waiting, no artistry, only heat and care. For soldiers accustomed to scarcity, it felt miraculous. For prisoners, it was redemption. The German women who first mocked it soon began to ask questions. They wanted to know how to make it. Through broken English and gestures, the American cooks demonstrated cornmeal, sugar, salt, a bit of milk, a spoon of fat. The women scribbled notes on scraps of paper, guarding them like treasure. Those notes, decades later, would resurface in family kitchens across Germany. The recipes traveled farther than the war itself. Behind the simple exchange stood a philosophy born in Detroit assembly lines and Kansas mills, the idea that food could be standardized, industrialized, and mobilized. It was the same philosophy that built Sherman tanks and Liberty ships. Engineers like Captain Edward P. Hogan of the Quartermaster Corps designed ration systems using statistical models, ensuring that every ingredient could be replaced, rationed, or multiplied without collapse. Cornbread was not an accident of culture. It was the output of mathematics and machinery. German reports recovered after the war contained remarks of astonishment. American logistical superiority defies comprehension, one officer wrote after inspecting captured supplies. Even their prison camps are factories of comfort. To the Germans, this capacity, feeding prisoners with surplus, felt like an extension of America's industrial soul. In a war defined by steel and fire, the true weapon was the ability to sustain life while waging total destruction. 1. Winter evening, after another delivery of cornbread, a captured Luftwaffe nurse approached the wire. She asked the American cook if he missed home. He nodded, smiling faintly. "Every time I bake this," he said, "I'm back on my mother's porch." The woman stared at the yellow loaf in her hands, realizing for the first time that it carried memory, not mockery. She tore it in half and shared it with the woman beside her. Inside the camp, the mood began to shift. The bread became more than food. It became ritual. The prisoners waited for it, planned their day around it. Some sang quietly when it arrived. The guards noticed fewer escape attempts, fewer fights. Even the Red Cross inspectors commented on the calm. Humanity, it seemed, had found its way into the cracks of barbed wire. As spring approached, the war outside the fences was ending. The Rhine had fallen, the Reich crumbled, and columns of refugees filled the roads. Inside the camp, however, the ovens still burned, steady and patient. The American cooks kept baking, unaware that their humble craft had become a quiet legend. The women who once laughed now gathered near the kitchens daily, offering help, washing pans, fetching water, cleaning trays. They did it for a piece of cornbread, yes, but also for connection. Every exchange, every word, chipped away at the walls the war had built. In a world where bombs had erased cities, a simple loaf had begun rebuilding trust grain by grain. Yet beyond those fences, a larger truth was taking shape, one the prisoners couldn't yet see. America's ability to feed friend and foe alike wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. The Allies understood that the war would not end with surrender. It would end with rebuilding minds, and in that mission, even a yellow square of cornmeal carried weight, because soon, as the guns fell silent and the Reich's banners turned to ash, those same German women would be sent home. They would remember the smell of butter and corn, the strange sweetness of American bread, and they would carry it with them into the ruins of a nation. The taste of their captors' kindness would linger, and it would remind them that sometimes the victors win not just with firepower, but with warmth. And as Germany starved through the first winter of peace, that taste, the golden cornbread baked by former enemies, would come to mean something no one had expected at all. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Entire cities were skeletons of stone and smoke, their hearts gutted by fire. But in the wreckage of surrender, the hunger remained. The winter that followed, called the Hunger Winter by the Germans, would claim more lives than many battles. Rations dwindled to a few hundred calories per day. People boiled weeds, scraped frost for water, tore wallpaper for its glue. Yet among those struggling to rebuild were women who remembered something unexpected: a yellow bread, soft and sweet, baked by their captors. They had laughed at it once, then begged for it, then tried to make it themselves. Now, as occupation began, and America took up the strange task of feeding the same people it had defeated, that humble food returned. The U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division, along with the nascent United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, distributed surplus grain to German civilians. Cornmeal, cheap and abundant in American silos, was shipped by the ton. And once again, kitchens across the broken Reich began to smell faintly of it. For German women who had been prisoners, it was a haunting déjà vu. They stood in queues holding ration tins, watching U.S. trucks roll through streets still dusted with plaster. When they received their first sacks of maizmeal, many recognized the label from the POW camp stores. The same words, the same faintly foreign color. They took it home to kitchens where the walls were cracked and the ovens cold. But they baked anyway. Those first loaves were rough and uncertain, too dry, too sweet, too heavy. Yet they carried something powerful: memory. Memory of a strange kindness amid humiliation, of a moment when an enemy shared food instead of bullets. It was nourishment, but it was also a message. The same country that had defeated them was now feeding their children. And so slowly, the cornbread took on a second life, not as mockery, not as surrender, but as survival. In American reports filed from occupied zones, officers noted the surprising popularity of cornmeal among civilians. One relief worker in Frankfurt wrote that, "Many women prefer it now. They say it feels like strength." Another described seeing children licking crumbs from their palms as though it were candy. Cornbread had crossed from symbol of foreignness to symbol of hope. It was no longer animal feed. It was sustenance in its purest form. The transformation carried deep psychological resonance. Allied psychologists studying post-war morale understood that hunger could reignite hatred faster than propaganda could suppress it. Feeding people, they argued, was the first step in reshaping minds. Food was the language of peace. A warm meal could succeed where leaflets failed. And so across the ruins of occupied Germany, the scent of cornbread drifted again, not from military ovens this time, but from relief kitchens and women's homes. One former prisoner, interviewed decades later, recalled how the American recipe became a family heirloom. "My mother made it every Sunday after the war," she said. She said it reminded her that even in the worst moments, there was still humanity. Another remembered her shock when she first saw cornmeal sold openly in markets during the Marshall Plan years. "I never thought I'd buy it willingly," she laughed. "But I did. We all did." Meanwhile, in America, the engineers and bakers who had made the wartime supply miracle possible turned their innovations towards civilian life. The same techniques used to ship cornmeal across oceans now fed a booming domestic market. Pre-packaged mixes, shelf-stable flours and quick-bake formulas filled post-war grocery stores. What had been a soldier's ration became a household staple. The US had proved that efficiency could feed the world, and it did. The legacy of the cornbread moment went beyond kitchens. It reshaped perceptions. The American GI, once feared as the faceless enemy, began to appear in stories as the man who shared food, who smiled, who baked. The kindness of ordinary soldiers softened the edges of occupation. For many Germans, the first step toward accepting defeat and democracy was not a speech or a treaty, but a warm loaf handed across a fence. Psychologists from the Strategic Bombing Survey noted how rapidly German morale shifted once humanitarian aid began. Gratitude, one report stated, is the most enduring form of surrender. In the eyes of the people, America became not just the destroyer of the Reich, but the restorer of sustenance. And the cornbread, trivial though it seemed, embodied that identity. Warmth in the shadow of ruin. Inside universities and think tanks, analysts studying the morale weapon cited the POW camp stories as evidence. They concluded that small gestures, shared meals, fair treatment, had lasting political power. Compassion, they realized, could pacify where fear could not. It was an early glimpse of what would later become America's soft power, the ability to influence through abundance and generosity. But for the women themselves, the memory was personal, almost intimate. In diaries found decades later, they described the first bite, the steam, the sweetness. One wrote, "It tasted like forgiveness, though no one said the word." Another simply noted, "It was the first time I stopped being afraid." In the long twilight between war and peace, that mattered more than flags or speeches. By 1947, cornbread was appearing in German cookbooks. Adapted recipes replaced milk with water, butter with lard, sugar with honey or syrup. It became a hybrid dish, half American, half German. In a sense, it was the culinary mirror of post-war Europe, scarred but surviving, strange but new. It was also the quiet proof that ideas, once shared, could not be bombed back into silence. American occupation policy slowly gave way to partnership, and with it came cultural exchange. Movies, music, chewing gum, and yes, food. Cornbread became a small but real part of that tapestry. The same ovens that once baked for prisoners now baked for families in peace. Across Germany's recovery years, as factories restarted and cities rebuilt, the smell returned again, no longer foreign, no longer humbling, but familiar. And the women who had first tasted it behind wire fences became its unlikely ambassadors. Some taught the recipe to their children. Others mentioned it in interviews or memoirs. It was a kindness we didn't deserve, one wrote, but one we never forgot. The cornbread story might seem trivial beside the titanic machinery of war, the tanks, the bombers, the burning cities. But history often turns on smaller things. A shared meal can change more hearts than 1,000 proclamations. What began as mockery ended as memory, passed from one generation to the next. Proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, decency could survive. In the end, that golden loaf was more than food. It was an answer to brutality, a soft rebuttal to vengeance. The same ovens that once fed soldiers fighting across Europe now fed their former enemies. It was not planned, not written into strategy manuals, yet it became one of the most profound acts of reconciliation the war ever produced. And so, years later, when one of those women, old now, grey-haired, her grandchildren gathered at the table, brought out a pan of cornbread, she smiled faintly. "We used to laugh at this," she said. "Then we learned what it meant." She cut it into squares, passed them around, and watched as the children bit in, without knowing they were tasting history. Because in that simple bread, born of necessity, baked in war, shared in peace, lay a truth that would outlast empires. In every battle between hatred and hunger, kindness is the stronger fire.